that is convening this conversation this morning. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. The webinar is being recorded and streamed live on YouTube. The recording will be available after the session. Please may the participants make use of the Q&A box should you have any questions. And we do encourage you to please ask questions and engage with the conversation that's happening this morning. So just before we get into, I see participants are joining as we go. So I will give a few minutes for people to join us, and then we can start the conversation. I'll introduce the panelists, give a bit of context to today's conversation, and then we will get into the discussion. Okay, I think we'll start and people will join us in as we go. As I said, my name is Tariro Sekramai. I will be moderating today's conversation, which is our discussion around public participation of the youth in political processes, in elections and other formal political processes. This morning, we'll be having a bit of a regional reflection, looking at the most recent trends on youth participation in Kenya, Zambia, and South Africa in the most recent elections that have happened in those countries. To guide us through this conversation this morning, we've got Ms. Sylvia Katua, who's a project officer at Mzalendo Trust in Kenya. She's also an advocate of the Kenya High Court. We also have Mr. Spamandla Mhlongo, who is a senior project manager, project officer at the Democracy and Development Project, and Ms. Buyokasi Fuchani, who is who is also a project officer at Oxfam South Africa, and Mr. Guest Nyirenda, the executive director of Young Vote in Zambia. They will be guiding the conversation this morning. Just to put a bit of context and background to this conversation that we're having, public participation is protected and guaranteed for in many legal instruments on the continent, specifically the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the African Charter on Elections, Governance and Democracy, as well as international instruments such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Specifically, the participation of youth is also protected in the African Youth Charter. And youth make up, as of 2021, approximately 40% of the continent, making youth an important demographic in many sectors on the continent, which they will become key participants and contributors. Of course, given this context, the issue of participation in elections and political processes is important to discuss and address, given the extent of youth in the populations. Looking specifically at the continent, we see decreasing rates of formal participation in politics, in formal political processes such as elections and other formal political processes, with few exceptions on the continent, most notably seen recently in Zambia. We cannot undermine the legitimacy that is derived from free and fair elections and other formal processes in decision-making, which is dependent on the participation of an engaged and knowledgeable citizenry. And broad participation speaks to true representation and legitimacy. And we see this question of legitimacy coming up and the question of true representation coming up regarding the participation of youth in politics in Africa, particularly around governance, where studies have shown that even though the youth make up a significant portion of the population of Africa, approximately 14% of parliamentarians in Africa are below the age of 40. And the African Youth Charter sets the age of youth as up to 35. We also see that this is mirrored in other key positions of power and decision-making. I mean, one has to only look at the average age of our presidents on the continent to see the level of participation and inclusion of the youth. And these are some of the reasons that have been given by youth for not participating, for voter apathy, because of lack of true representation and meaningful inclusion. But we also cannot peddle the narrative that youth are apathetic to politics, because while we don't see increasing rates of formal participation, we see increase in forms of political participation through protest action, through social movements and community engagement. So young people are an important demographic on the continent, and it is important, as well as legally mandated in many instruments, as I've mentioned, for us to promote the participation of young people in elections. And hopefully, as we convene conversations like this, we will take more meaningful steps to hear the youthful voice on how to increase participation and why we are seeing these declining rates of participation, and in instances where we have seen robust participation, what has gone right, what has gone wrong, and what can we improve on, and what can we learn from on the continent, because I mean, it is a subsection of the continent, a regional discussion, and we do hope that we will have more of these discussions and spread to more regions on the continent, as well as allowing these discussions to culminate in policies that will one day influence the meaningful participation of youth in politics. So without further ado, I will hand over to our panelists who will give us some opening remarks. I hand over now to Ms. Sylvia Katua.
Good afternoon, Tariro, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. I hope you're able to hear me clearly.
We can hear you and we can see you.
Thank you. As Tariro has mentioned, my name is Sylvia Katua, and I'm a program officer at Mzalendo Trust. Mzalendo Trust is a Kenyan-based parliamentary monitoring organization that keeps an eye on Kenyan parliament and across Africa, and we want to promote open, inclusive, and accountable parliaments in Kenya and across Africa. I think for us, we'd say we are the babies of this conversation, because we've just had our elections most recently. That was in August of this year, and we saw some very interesting trends. So maybe first thing to note is that out of the 22 million voters, only 39.84% were young people, and our constitution defines young people as those who are below 35 years old, so that's 35 and below, under Article 260. Kenya's youth are the largest demographic unit and the largest political constituency. We constitute 75% of the Kenyan population. That's out of about 50 million. We're now heading to about 50 million. And we constitute more than 3/4 of that. But yet, during the registration period, only 39.4% of the 22 million were young people. That's less than 0.5%. In terms of looking at the candidates who vied for positions and who were cleared by the electoral body, the Electoral Commission, only 4,508 out of 16,000, about 16,000 were young people. That again shows you how few young people were interested in running for political office. But then in some good news, maybe just to show you the sort of difference we've had. So before, in the 12th Parliament, that was between the period of 2017 and 2022, young people that's below 35 years old, below 40 years old, actually in Parliament, they just try to raise it a bit higher because we are very few in Parliament, only constituted 6.3%. Young people constituted 3.6%. But currently, we're at 14%. Young MPs are now more, so there's an increase in terms of percentage, but that does not mean that young people, their political participation increased during the electoral period. And maybe it would even be, I'd say, disingenuous for us to just narrow political participation just to running for office or voting. I think it's even, it would be even important for us, imperative for us to also look at it in terms of young people engaging with the political electoral process from the beginning to the end. So of course, we understand that elections are not just one event, it's an entire process. So from the political party process, from the nominations, from the campaigning, from supporting the candidates, and throughout that entire process, we'd see that in some instances, young people would be involved, but in others, even though they're involved and you'd see them in campaigns, they'd outrightly tell you, and you could see even from the news sources and the media articles coming out, that they would not be intending to vote. And there are a couple of factors leading up to this. I think, first of all, would be the issue of political parties. And so here you find that perhaps there's this sort of individualization of political parties, that are political parties centered around one person, and political parties are also not very well institutionalized. So they're not the proper structures to ensure that young people are able to join in. A person knows that, okay, I've registered as a member of this political party, what next? You find that there are youth leagues, but they're not supported, they're not strengthened. There's lack of that mentorship that young people in political parties yearn to be able to participate in the process. And another issue around political parties we've also seen was the chaotic party primaries. In Kenya now, they're the nominations. So last year we had the political parties amendment bill, now an act. It was passed in parliament early this year. And this act allowed for the formation of coalitions, to be able to allow for coalitions rather to run as one political outfit, as opposed to having single political parties proposing, persons to run for political offices. Now it allowed coalition. So several parties come together and form a coalition, and that coalition can front a candidate. And this had some ramifications on the participation of young people. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more. We also saw the introduction of new methods for nomination of candidates, such as political zoning. And so through the coalitions, you'd find that perhaps coalition A has a stronghold in this particular area. And so they'd say, for this particular area, we'd only want to front person X, and that person is not a young person. That is a person who has access to deep networks, a person who has deep pockets, things that young people would not be able to have at the very least. I think another key factor is also looking at the cost of politics. Running for political office in Kenya is very expensive. I think among one of the most expensive in the world, because even our elections are among the most expensive in the world. And so you find issues to do with voter bribery, lack of a regulatory framework. There is a legal framework in place. We currently have the Campaign Financing Act of 2013, but almost 10 years later, that act has not been operationalized, it's not been implemented, and this is because there are lack of regulations. So the electoral body here, that's the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission, has brought these regulations to Parliament twice before, but they've been shot down in Parliament. And you can see why politicians do not want to have a regulation that will regulate how much they spend on political election processes and what they do. So they do not want that scrutiny, but this is a disadvantage for young people. If we also just look at the general apathy as I conclude, would just to look at the current climate that we're in. There's a very high rate of unemployment in Kenya. Very few young people have access to jobs or access to credit, even for their personal businesses that they've had. Looking at previous regimes, the youth agenda has been very tokenistic. And so you find that, yes, we have one or two young people in government, but it's just a way to sway young people to support the government, but there's not really that meaningful participation of young people in that entire process. There has also been a tribal narrative, especially in terms of elections before. We've seen it in 2007, which I think is the election that most people know Kenya for because of the ensuing violence that arose out of it. But this was a new election. I'd say this was different in the sense that there were no tribal narratives being fronted, but instead the conversation revolved around the economy and where we're at. We've raised our debt ceiling twice. Kenya has a lot of debt obligations to foreign countries, to other countries outside of Africa. And this took center stage in terms of the campaigning that candidates took advantage of. And so at least there was that particular shift. We've also noticed that for young people, and especially young women, who we categorize as a specific demographic by themselves, feel disillusioned, especially because the 2/3 gender rule, which is in our constitution, has not yet been implemented till date. A good example would also be looking at the current cabinet we have. I think we have fewer women compared to men, and we've not yet accomplished or met, rather, the 2/3 gender rule. So issues to do with runaway inflation, issues to do with high levels of unemployment, issues to do with perpetration of unfair justice, abuse of power, and even just looking at the corruption levels in the country have really disillusioned young people towards the election process. And there's also a notion that, the outcome is already predetermined. So I think that, among many other things we may continue talking about, have affected the participation of young people in the 2022 elections. And lastly, also looking at violence. This is not only violence that's physical, but also online violence. We have a very vibrant online space, but young people have been subjected to intimidation, harassment, and especially those who are running for office. And there has been little to no recourse for them. And this again puts them off towards the entire process, not just in running, but even in going out to register and going out to vote, and even engaging in policy debates that had been held around that entire process. And so you'd find that things are being discussed that would affect them, but there's not that interest, there's not that a level of trying to understand what is going on. And in fact, the electoral board even noticed this. And you would see from some of the reports they released towards the election, and they were noting that even despite the kind of campaigns they launched, they tried to move even online, trying to have a TikTok page just to be able to understand young people and to, connect with them on that level. But young people are not interested. So I think more needs to be done. There are a couple of other factors, but I think even as we continue talking, we'll be able to just unearth them and look at them in depth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for that insightful perspective on Kenya. And I think something that you said stood out, and it's a common, among all the other things that you said, a common issue is the issue of tokenism, which then leads young people to not participate in formal processes, including the election. And like you said, there's more to formal processes than elections. And I agree with the issue of tokenism and the lack of relevance in these processes towards actually targeting young people in a meaningful way. So that will take us to our next speaker, who is Ms. Buyokazi Buchani. Thank you, Buyokazi.
Thank you so much, Sergio. I think just to start off, I think a lot of what has been mentioned by the previous speaker also mirrors the reality in South Africa. If we just look at the most recent elections, the local government elections, the trend of low and decliner voter turnout has continued, particularly among the youth. A report I was reading yesterday, which was particularly interesting, that analyzed 5 metros and the 3 major parties and the voter participation and turnout of these parties. What the report had found was that over nearly 2 million of 18 to 19-year-olds who were eligible to vote in the last election, about 90% didn't register to vote, let alone show up at the polls. And less than 20% of those aged between 20 to 35 who were not registered to vote and didn't show up. Less than 20% of 20 to 35-year-olds actually registered to vote at the last election and showed up at the polls. So undeniably, South Africa, like most of the region, I think with the exception of Zambia, has a voter apathy issue. And I think the reasons have been documented. Well, the general reasons, I would say, which is individual reasons, such as people saying they don't have time to vote, et cetera, or they have other responsibilities at the time, administrative reasons, such as the barriers to actually showing up at the polls and actually voting, things like, identification documents and stuff like that. And also a lack of faith in the performance of government. People aren't getting public services, so they're not encouraged to vote. So like the previous speaker mentioned, there is an increasing despondency in not only voting, but in entrusting those who are put into power to actually deliver services. So the youth and the population more generally have lost confidence in whether or not participating in elections is even worth their time. And also there's just a lack of political alignment. People don't feel like the parties or the ruling parties actually align or actually speak to some of their needs, particularly as young people in South Africa. But what was interesting for me was outside of voter apathy and looking at the numbers of those who don't vote, what is interesting to me is looking at the socio-economic dynamics or analysis of those who actually vote. Who is voting? Why are they voting? I think what is motivating those groups of people to vote? And what is interesting also in that, in the analysis that I speak about the local government elections, is that I think in South Africa, there is a general narrative that it is the older cohort. So it's the above 35 and even the older generation that are keeping the ruling party in power. But an analysis of the last elections showed that actually youth, so those aged between 18 and 35-year-old, made up a whopping 59% of people who actually showed up to vote for the ANC. So I think those are some of the interesting dynamics and some of the interesting trends we should be looking at in order to understand why young South Africans are voting for who they're voting for, rather than who isn't voting. Because I think those who aren't voting have lost faith, or they don't see that, voting is actually exercising your democratic rights. And for me, it makes me particularly sad as a young person to see that one of the key cornerstones of a functioning democracy is people exercising their right to vote, using their power. But people have lost faith in their power to vote, and that has created a situation where the people who are put into power have lost interest in being held accountable, because the mechanisms that we have as young people and as South Africans to hold them accountable is one that we are not using. So I think in looking at the socioeconomic dynamics of those who voted, if you look at it by race, Black young South Africans voted the most for the ANC. So that alone disputes the fact that it is the older generation that is keeping the ruling parties in power. And that's something that needs to be addressed as well. Why are those young people voting for the people that they're voting for? And of course, if you look at it by gender, men are voting more than women. Another aspect that needs to be unpacked: what are the barriers that are preventing women from going to the polls? What sort of things can be put into place to ensure that we see greater gender parity in terms of voting? And also, in looking at the unemployment dynamics as well as those who voted, particularly for the ruling party, it is mostly the unemployed who continue to vote for the ruling party. I think the stats, if I quickly check here, about 61% of the unemployed voted for the ruling party. Again, why are those people voting for who they're voting for? I think a lot more conversations need to be had in terms of the decision-making of those who continue to vote rather than those who don't vote. Because I think that will illuminate why those people actually are motivated to vote and how we can encourage those who are not voting to vote. yeah, and if you look at the education levels, again, we see higher levels of those who are not educated voting, which is also another interesting dynamic for me, because you often hear that people don't have access to information, blah, 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 but you find that it is the uneducated, those who are unemployed, people in the lower economic class who actually show up more at the polls rather than those with more access to information, with more free time, etc. And also, if you look at income dynamics, there is a higher percentage of, as I mentioned, of those who earn less that actually show up to the polls than high income earners. And also in rural areas, peri-urban areas, townships, there are actually higher voter numbers than in urban areas. So I think for me, those are the interesting socioeconomic dynamics that I would like us to unpack further and to actually have a deeper look at, rather than why the people who aren't voting are voting. And also, I think it's really interesting, and I'm really glad that we have someone from Kenya who, I think not Kenya, sorry, Zambia, which is really an exception to the trends that we're seeing across the region and across the continent. So why are young people in Zambia voting? What has that meant for their democracy? Do Zambians feel or have more confidence in using their power in order to decide who gets to, be put into power and not? So I think more than anything, I have really questions that I would like us to continue to have in the discussion. And also really I'm interested in the lessons from others across the region, particularly from Zambia. Thank you.
Thank you for your Kazi. I think you raise many interesting points there, particularly around the use of not voting as a vote of no confidence in the leaders, which is a trend that we see on the continent at large. And I think another important factor is also looking at the socioeconomic factors that influence, beyond voting, that influence formal participation and as well as participation in elections. I will come back when I have my round of questions, and we will unpack more of what, especially in South Africa, which has been reported as the most unequal society in the world, what role inequality plays in participation, especially among young people, as you've raised the interesting factors which reveal that it's mostly the unemployed, the lower educated, which would typically be classified as a group that is more apathetic, who are actually going to the polls and actually taking part in electoral processes. It would be interesting to note if beyond elections, how are different demographics participating with the formal political system outside of elections. We'll come back to more of that just now, but I would like to now hand over to Spamandla.
Thank you, Tariro, and thank you to the Center for Human Rights for hosting this webinar. I think it's always important to try and talk through some of the factors that are affecting young people's participation. And Vyoka's presentation also sort of puts a bit of a spanner in the works insofar as my presentation is concerned, because I think those are questions that I find quite interesting as well. And generally, when you enter discussions like this, it doesn't go as far as analyzing the socioeconomic conditions, and particularly to the extent that it would appear that the more sort of peri-urban / rural communities still have quite a significant tendency of participating in these processes. And it would be interesting, of course, to further go into that discussion. I think before I go into some of the things that I feel are interesting for our discussion as far as the motivations of people, let me just sort of run through a bit of statistics. So we all know that young people remain the most vulnerable when it comes to the labor market. And I think the second quarter labor market survey by StatSA put us at around sort of 46.5% of youth unemployment. And if you were to look at the expanded definition of unemployment, then we also then just go to just above 60% of youth unemployment, and that those statistics themselves are quite interesting and problematic. But when we then go into the further debriefing around the socioeconomic conditions of young people, so some of the things that people will tell you about, young people are unskilled, uneducated, etc. But if you also look at the extent to which undergraduates or graduates themselves are unemployed, that figure is also at around 40%. And that's quite a significant number, considering that potentially, aside from that 40%, about 50% of those who are employed are employed in things such as internships that go on forever and ever. They have to get multiple internships just to get the amount of experience that is deemed sufficient for the labor market. And so those are some of the challenges that young people encounter when they try to at least try and get a sense of being represented in the formal employment spaces. When we look at, for instance, the range of representation then of young people in leadership, and specifically around parliament and cabinet, etc., you'd see that in South African parliament, I think as of 2021, which is when we had our reshuffle from 2019, the cabinet only has about 20 of ministers rather are over the age of 60 years old. We have 30 ministers. Only one of them is under the age of 40. So that's starting to show a picture that says, is there an incentive for young people to be vested in the political outcomes of this country if those political outcomes don't eventually lead to greater representation and more engaged participation on that account? If we look at parliament, for instance, we have only 9% of parliamentarians in South Africa falling in the youth bracket, which is 35 and under. And of course, we can also start to problematize things like the youth bracket going all the way up to 35 across the continent. And because we look at the different segments of youth, for instance, from 15 to 25, 25 to 30, 30 to 35, all of those people are experiencing different developmental challenges. And of course, the socioeconomic conditions under which each of these segments are experiencing are also quite interesting, and would be important to try and unpack, to try and see what are the interests to which we should start appealing, so that we can start to engage them a bit further. And then, of course, those are sort of the larger figures when it comes to representation, formal participation of young people. So if only 9% of the policymakers in this country are under 35 years old, why are we surprised then, for instance, when we have a National Youth Development Agency that's not working as optimally as it ought to? And I think perhaps this year might be a bit of a different sort of picture, given that we just had a new board elected to form part of the National Youth Development Agency. The National Youth Policy itself, if you look at the National Youth Policy 2020 to 2025 in South Africa, you'd also see that it was a recycled document. There was no real engagement with one of the core issues that young people themselves are confronted with. And as a result, you think about how seriously the parliamentarians take youth work. If you look at the ministry that's meant to be representing young people in particular in this country, it's bundled with other disadvantaged or previously disadvantaged groups, such as women and the people living with disabilities. And so is a single ministry able to actually deal with challenges that confront such a differing segment of people? And of course, some people, when we talk about youth and women and people living with disabilities, they say those are cross-cutting issues. We need to be able to make policies that speak to each of them. So everything that's affecting, but it's about, there are special interest groups in South Africa that need to be catered for quite significantly. And of course, it would appear, at least in the broader spectrum, that young people don't see themselves in the imaginations of the policymakers and the imagination of the political leadership of this country. And so quite often what I think an Afrobarometer study that was run back in 2018 showed that young people themselves don't have a vested level of trust in the institutions that are meant to be taking care of our democracy that are meant to ensure that we move forward in a meaningful way. And those institutions, the level of trust in those institutions goes quite low, especially when you look at local government level in particular, because at least insofar as the ways in which young people interface with local government, there's a sense that they are able to see the problems that are happening in local government, but there's no space for them to be able to actually participate and meaningfully engage with some of the things that they ought to be dealing with in that space. And so being shut out and shut down in those spaces seems quite problematic. Perhaps before I move on to the discussion around the electoral amendment bill and perhaps a glimmer of hope in the space of political participation in this country, let me also talk briefly about what I think political parties use young people for and why we find ourselves in this space. The ruling party, the African National Congress, hasn't had a functioning youth league, for instance, since the disbandment of the youth league back in 2012, or at least when people were chucked out of the youth league. And then we had what was a fallacy of a youth league for 3 to 5 years for the term of what other people called Oros. I've forgotten his actual name, but colleagues will remind me. And so we haven't had a functional youth league from the ruling party, which for them was supposedly a space where young people are able to create and ideate issues and policies that are meant to be speaking specifically for that youth demographic. Other organizations rely quite heavily on student support insofar as student movements. And if we have to do a genuine analysis of student participation in political moments or in political, you see that across different campuses, voter turnout generally doesn't go above 25% of the student population of those specific campuses. And so you would question whether the representation or the ways in which student politics itself undergoes is whether it's actually representative of the entire student demographic. Of course, there are outliers where there might be more participation than other spaces, but generally, even within student movements, that participation is still quite minimal. But of course, my view specifically around youth movement, student movement, etc., is that I don't necessarily care for them. I think that the youth movements for political parties are an excuse for the older generation to say young people have an area to play with far away from the mainstream politics of that specific political party. And so when youth issues are meant to be taken in the mainstream conversation within that political party's ideation of what their manifestos, as well as policies and ideology ought to be, they're not considered as seriously as they need to be. And so there are glimpses of hope insofar as participation. So young people are not apathetic. They're not apathetic. They are not disinterested. It's just that they don't necessarily trust the institutions that are meant to be taken care of, the different mechanisms for participation. So for instance, the IEC, whilst from an institutional level, we can say that it functions well as organizations working in the civic space. But insofar as their ability to create messaging, to create the different communication mechanisms for developing trust within the youth demographic, that's quite a bit of a failure. Unfortunately, it was funny to watch the XA campaign being launched back in 2019, I think, ahead of the 2019 election. And so there's a disconnect precisely because of the fact that young people generally aren't in the rooms where these decisions about what our messaging ought to look like are actually happening. And so that's the discomfort. Yes, there's a lot of participation on social media. Yes, we've been able to convene around different mechanisms for protest. We are very issue specific as young people. And so if there's a space where young people can be mobilized, this try and speak to the core and the essence of their issues. So the glimmer of hope comes in here. So the unfortunate part with the establishment politics, the political parties that have existed for a while, is that they haven't been willing to play around with their politics, to think about innovative ways to engage the core issues that people, and particularly young people, are confronted with in this country, are confronted with. So the case of the New Nation movement that came about in 2020 which was trying to say the Electoral Amendment Act, as it stood at the time, was not constitutional, and it ought to be amended. Was won at the Constitutional Court. Of course, the Constitutional Court in June, I think, it declared that the Electoral Amendment Act was unconstitutional because it didn't allow independent candidates to contest elections at national and provincial levels. Thus, it essentially forced people to affiliate to a political party if you wanted to contest for an election, which is unconstitutional because, you know, your right to affiliation is yours. It should be something that you're able to decide on yourself. Of course, among the fundamental rights, responsibilities, and powers afforded to people in our democracy, the opportunity to vote for public representatives and to stand to be in elected office is something that's enshrined in our constitution. So the current bill at the moment is being contested by a number of civil society organizations, given that the public participation process itself was flawed. I remember seeing and watching the public participation. I think it happened in January and February. And to a large extent, you saw that people were bussed in to start speaking about specific narrative. You could see that there was a script from specific political parties. And so it wasn't open to a lot of people because there was still quite significant or stringent, stringent COVID regulations that prevented people from gathering in those spaces. But also, even at Parliament, once the public participation process itself went through Parliament, these people don't have an incentive to actually reform the current electoral laws because it displaces their hegemony insofar as the ways in which power itself plays out in South Africa. And so we've entrusted the same people that this act is likely to displace to be able to undergo a process that's going to be meaningful. Public commentary was reopened but closed again in 26 September. And as it looks, the languaging of the bill itself is quite problematic and needs to be refined quite significantly. But there's also a sense that those public comments, that period itself was too short. And to the extent that it was just to try and placate all of the voices that were saying, you guys are not doing the work that's necessary to reform the electoral amendment bill, to the extent that it allows for genuine participation of independent candidates. And so there's still a lot of space to be able to debate all of this. And in that regard, I think the DDP, Rivonia Circle, My Vote Counts, and other organizations are hosting a number of engagements across the country over the next couple of weeks and have been doing so in the previous month or so to try and canvass support for greater pressure on parliamentarians to try and take this opportunity seriously, because there's a sense that young people would be better emboldened, especially when I think it was Sylvia was talking about the cost of being part of a political movement or political party or campaign, that should we have the space for independent candidates to contest, we remove the barriers to access quite significantly, and hopefully the act itself will put us in that space. Of course, we are under time pressure, but there's also a sense that we might be, if we allow the act to go through as it is. I think an electoral expert, Mike Atkins, was saying we're essentially walking into a constitutional crisis, and we're just walking into it without actually thinking about the consequences thereof. I think I'll pause there. I might have gone slightly over my time, but I apologize.
Thank you, Spamandla. Thank you also for those very insightful remarks, especially given the South African context. And I think you bring a very interesting dynamic where the role of political parties also in disillusioning the youth, which is something that people have, the previous panelists have mentioned, but one almost expects the situation to be better in South Africa, because I mean, during the discussion today, Zambia is almost kind of our gold standard, but I mean, in terms of democracy on the continent, South Africa is also regarded as a beacon. So, the issue of political parties and manipulation and actual tokenism, as well as was raised by Sylvia and Buyokazi, is a very pertinent issue to discuss. I think I will hand over to Guess before we get to our question and answer session. And I'll just remind the participants that please Please be very interactive. The question and answer box is open. As soon as we finish our reflections or even during, feel free to give your input, because again, we are having conversations about young people with young people, so that the solutions that we need and our perspectives come from us, as opposed to, us being relegated to spaces where our conversations are not important, and as opposed to the messaging that is being condescended to us from other sources. So please feel free to enter your questions and comments to the panelists and generally into the question and answer box. And let me just see now if guest is online. Okay, I see that you may be struggling a bit to connect there. Okay, that's fine. While we wait for guests to come and connect, I suppose that we can delve into some of the discussions that we've canvassed in the remarks of the previous speakers. And I think one of the issues that's coming up very strongly is the relevance of messaging and the relevance of the participation of young people. And I think one of the ways that has been suggested as a way to address political disillusionment among young people, which we see happening at differing rates of success on the continent, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, across the continent at large, is trying to make campaigns and political participation youth-friendly or young people-friendly, but in almost a condescending manner. So Sylvia mentioned the issue of TikTok, and I think Spamanla, you mentioned the XA campaign in South Africa. And while the key issue is that young people are not at the center of the rooms in which these decisions are being made, or their voices are not taken seriously in these rooms, I think that these drives are taking part in many countries and still fail to generate the requisite interest around elections and around just general participation. So you've mentioned the electoral bill that was public comment was open for its Spamanla, and it would be interesting to see to what extent young people have also engaged with that, because I mean it is something that's going to affect them, as you rightly mentioned. And if we look at today's discussion, with the exception of Zambia, perhaps once guest comes, it would be interesting to see as well if that is actually the case. These educational programs, these drives to target the youth have not been successful. And I suppose the key question is, how do we improve the messaging, even beyond elections, but towards formal participation in general, towards that, there's this bill in Parliament, be interested in commenting on it. There's this policy that's being driven. How do we increase the relevance of the messaging that encourages the youth to take part in these processes? This is open to the whole panel for us to just, think about that and speak about what is it, because we've spoken about how it's being done wrong, but I mean, ultimately, what we would like to see is it being done right, or it being done in a meaningful way that's going to result in participation of young people. So I'll throw it to Spamanla because you recently spoke, but it's open to the rest of the panel. How do we see the messaging being improved? So from political campaigns, political parties, beyond just saying, let's do a dance on TikTok, because like you said, also the fact that youth goes up to 35, it's going to work. A dance on TikTok might work for 18-year-olds. It might not even, but as the older you get in the youth bracket, the more you have to be careful about what relevant messaging is. So I'll throw it to you, Spamanla, and open to the rest of the panel. You can come in on that. How can we improve the messaging and make it more meaningful and relevant? Thank you.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think the work has been sort of forced onto us as civil society organizations to try and create the necessary sort sort of drive for young people to start participating. And so the institutions that are entrusted with this, primarily political parties, I think maybe they might need to start paying us in terms so far as messaging is concerned. Maybe we should stop offering free advice to political parties. They clearly have the money, and so should start paying us. That's a one-off. I think they definitely should. My details are publicly available. So, but just in terms of what then the other institutions to start trying to do. If you look at the public participation processes for Parliament, and the ways in which those public participation processes have generally been advertised, it's still quite old media. And so when I talk about old media, it's still very much about the gazettes, the newspapers, and sometimes even radio. Those are mechanisms or instruments that are not necessarily as engaging for most young people insofar as access. So very few young people are still reading actively those newspapers under which those gazettes themselves are being published under, or even where those publications themselves are being published under. So I think one is just to think about the differences insofar as the spaces where these messages are being published. But also once we find the right spaces, to also put the right people in charge of managing those spaces. And to give the ability for young people who are in those institutions the ability to actually run with it. Too often we put young people in positions where we either assert that they are managing a specific entity or aspect of a project, but we don't actually give them the ability to innovate for themselves, how they feel that messaging will happen. And unfortunately, if they don't start being part of those leadership structures, they don't have the ability to have a final word on how that messaging ends up going out. And so you might have one young person in a room with 30 people, and that's not enough ability for them to be able to exercise their voice and elevate their voice in that space. So I think that's one thing that we need to start. One is where are we putting out these messages? But secondly, once we have the right spaces, are we intentional about ensuring that the messaging actually speaks to the demographic? Or are we placating that demographic insofar as saying, you guys are very good with TikToks, we'll just do a quick TikTok dance, but that TikTok dance actually does nothing towards moving people to start actually doing the work. But beyond that, I feel that once we have the messaging right, or at least when we start getting closer to the messaging, the unfortunate part is that institutions need to be seen doing the necessary work of accountability and transparency that they are tasked with. Unfortunately, over the past 20 some odd years of our democracy, very few politically elected representatives have actually been taken to task in a real way. So very little accountability has been seen, and very little room has been created for young people to actually upward mobility of young people is actually quite strained, given the ways in which participation has been happening in this country. And so if we get the messaging right or start to get to that space, we also still need to start doing the bare minimum, because we're not asking a lot from these institutions and individuals and tasked with these roles, insofar as accountability and transparency. And I think at least that will start to move us in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Pamandla. So where and who are important, but also beyond the messaging, it is, institutions doing what they need to do to regain the trust of the people who they are trying to speak to. I see that guest is back on. Before the panel dives into the question, perhaps we could have guest's reflections, and then we will open the question to the rest of the panel, including guests. Yes, if you're on, you can go ahead, please.
Thank you, moderator. Are you able to hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. My apologies that my connectivity is quite poor. I've tried what I could to make things work, but I think they will work now. And thank you so much that I'm back online, and good afternoon, good morning to my fellow panelists. As introduced, my name is Ges Nyirenda from Zambia. I am executive director of an organization called Operation Young Vote. Operation Young Vote has been in existence since the year 2000. And as of last year, this year, August 11th, the organization turned 22 years old. And I've been with the organization through and through. I've not been in the same position, but I've just risen through the ranks. I was a young boy when I was joining, and because of my interest in youth matters and the plight of the youth, I am where I am with the organization. But quickly getting into the issues of the day, the elephant in the room, youth participation and engagement in governance generally, but also specifically in the electoral process and many other developmental endeavors. The case of Zambia is not so much different from what colleagues from South Africa and Kenya have brought forth. What they have said actually mirrors the situation back home in Zambia, except that Zambia is quite unique in the way the young people tend to take things, at different, turns. Generally, just to speak about the engagement and participation, you realize that yes, the aspect of tokenism is there, the aspect of decoration is there, where young people are just used as decorations. For example, when launching, huge projects, we have these young people that are brought to do the cultural dances. We have these young people that are brought forth to perform poetry, do poems and drama, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to young people sitting at the table of decision making, it has really been a tall order for Zambia, as it were. Currently, if you look at our, parliament, maybe before I get to parliament, the demographics of the country are such that the majority of the population are actually the young people themselves. Look, if you go back to the voter register 2021 voters roll, you realize that about 53% of the voters that registered then were young people, because right now Zambia has embarked on the continuous registration of voters. So we know that the numbers have kept on changing and increasing. But concentrating just on the 2021 voters roll, the young people were in the majority. Of course, women were more, because when you talk of women, you talk about the young women and also the older women. So the women were, getting to 56%, while the youth are 52 to 53%, which really is a good number. But when you look at in terms of youth offering themselves for leadership, I think this has been, a thorny issue in the sense that our politics are so, commercialized. When imagine one wants to contest as a councillor, they will need to pay thousands of kwacha. Very good amounts of dollars if we convert it to dollars. If one wants to contest as a member of parliament, it becomes worse. Even at presidential level, it's even worse, because at 35, our constitution allows a young person to contest for a presidency. So that is where the youth bracket is closed, from 18 to 35. So our kind of engagement, as it were, like I said, has been mainly that of tokenism and that of decoration. But we see that the young people in the country have really not, taken that and gone with it. We know that, for lack of a better term, the old folks have a tendency of, this political rule that is not written, but they practice it, where they say keep them poor and uninformed and continue to rule over them. And that has, I think, is something that across Africa is practiced, where young people are kept, poor, young people are kept uninformed and carrots dangled here and there, so that when they want to rise and they want to support one another, or they want to mobilize each other to go in as as a team that is mobilized and that is going to work with their fellow young people, you will see and find that the political elite, those old folks, mainly men, of course, a few women, but mainly men, they tend to use the tactic of divide and rule, where they ensure that they will use one or two very prominent and active young persons to fight the other team, so that at the end of the day, you concentrate on fighting one another, as opposed to you galvanizing yourselves and going into, the whole political and electoral a platform together as one. So we have seen that particular tendency has really been one of those that has led to the young people's engagement and participation in the electoral process, in politics, but also governance generally, to be at that very low level. But coupled to that is the aspect of the political parties themselves. If you look at how political parties play their politics in Africa, and Zambia specifically, is such that they have this tendency of relegating the young people to youth wings. And in essence, if you come to Zambia, and I'm sure this is, it goes across many African countries, the youth wings are mainly, in quotes unquote, seen as the political party security wing for the party, especially for the senior politicians that have money. And hence we have seen this tendency of young people being relegated to those wings, but also used as security. But beyond that, they are used to to fight other young people from other political parties. They are used in violence. They are used in stone throwing. They are used in hate speech. They are used in all these things that are malpractices per se in the electoral process. They are the ones that are sent on the ground as foot soldiers to go and campaign for the elite senior men of political parties, and a few senior women, of course. And that for us is something that is problematic. We have not seen maybe one or two young people rise and be part of the main body of the political party, because that's where decisions are made. If you look at matters to do with adoptions of young people to contest elections, you have brilliant young people in these political parties. You have brilliant young people, learned and experienced with all the expertise politically, but they don't see the light of day in terms of them being adopted to contest either in a local government election or even at parliamentary level, simply because those that are sitting at the decision-making table are only elders, and they will only deal with their own peers. They don't mind how much education, how much expertise, how much leadership qualities you may possess and have. All they mind is their peers, and they know that they will be able to help themselves. It's some kind of a big brother arrangement where, you know, they want to go with themselves as it were. So this for us has really been problematic in the country. But also, even going beyond that, we see that the president, when the president is elected, they have leverage according to the law, where they have 8 members to nominate to parliament. If you look at the members that are nominated to parliament, and even in the current setup, where of course the young people made the huge change in 2021, and our president has been so magnanimous enough, the New Dawn government has been so magnanimous enough to recognize the efforts and the abilities that the young people brought into the elections of 2021 and changed governments against all odds. But again, that appreciation is not matched with the actions. Like I was saying, if you look at those that he nominated as head of state, I mean, as president, there was no young person nominated there. It's only the old madalas, the old folk, as it were. We are not saying that they don't have the expertise, they don't have the ability, they don't have the what it takes. But what we are saying is that it is more sustainable to bring in young people on board, and especially young people that have the quality, young people that have the expertise, young people that have the leadership that Zambia and Africa generally is looking for. So we see that young people are appreciated at the level of voting, but not appreciated at the level of bringing them on board in terms of ensuring that there's equity in participation, especially where there are windows such as the 8 members of parliament to be nominated by the head of state. But beyond that, the constitution also provides for the president, when they are doing their appointments, either to cabinet or to other government positions, like permanent secretaries, like commissioners, and so on and so forth. It provides for a window that as those appointments are being done, the appointing authority will be alive to the groups that have for a long time been marginalized, and those are the young people, the women, and the persons with disabilities. But alas, that again is not seen that way. But of course, let me also mention that we saw a number of youth or young people appointed in relation to those that those that were elected to parliament, those that offered themselves as candidates and they won. A good number of them have been given appointments, but I think beyond just those that give themselves for leadership at election level, we expect that even other windows like nomination and other appointments, the young people would be brought on board, so that we see that this participation of young people is actually, it means a lot, and that the plight of young people is being attended to. Now, quickly, just coming to a few things that Zambia did for us to be able to see what we saw in 2021. And mind you, it was against all odds that there was change in Zambia in the elections of 2021, because then the party that was in power then had entrenched its malpractices to levels that are unbelievable. They tried their best to ensure that everyone believed them, that they were the Alpha and the Omega. They were the only ones that had money. Of course, with a lot of them, a lot of the monies, suspected to be proceeds of crime, and a lot of them are actually in court being tried right now. But I think they tried to manipulate almost everything. Some civil society organizations, of course, run by the young people, were actually fronted to go and do the campaigns with regards to laws that are inimical to democratic tenets and principles and values. But then the young people of this country did stand and said enough is enough, and they wanted a leadership that would give them what they envisaged to see in life. To be respected. One of the things that happened prior to the elections, just close to the elections last year, was the fact that young people were calling for demonstrations. They wanted to go out there and demonstrate and show, express themselves about a number of things that they were not happy with. But then government officials at the highest level, ministers, they actually stopped the young people, called on the law enforcers, and called the young people to be so naked to be able to advise the head of state, and they had no local standard, as it were, to do what they wanted to do. But young people, stood firm. And unfortunately, there were, this issue of the Public Order Act, where today they are given authority to go and demonstrate. Then on the 11th hour, that authority is actually removed, or gotten away, denied, and so on and so forth. So it was a circus where on one hand they would say, okay, you can go ahead and do your demonstration. On the other hand, just at the 11th hour, that particular right derogated or removed. Then so young people decided, okay, we need to do something that can shock these people. They said, whatever it takes, on this day, we are going to demonstrate. Of course, young people from higher institutions of learning, young people from civil society, young people generally from the community. But then, so government that time decided, okay, they said we had no manpower, no police to police your event. But then young people vowed and said, we are going to go ahead. And on the actual day, they deployed thousands and thousands of police in all streets in the capital. So young people said, okay, we want to beat these guys at their game. Young people went and demonstrated in the bush. They carried their placards, they carried everything they needed. And they just got videos, they got, photos, and posted all those on social media. And the demonstration was even more impactful than it would have been if young people were allowed to demonstrate from one point to the other on the streets. So then the whole world, in a fraction of a second, were able to see that this is what was happening in Zambia. The whole entire globe was able to appreciate that, look, what is happening in Zambia is uncalled for with regards to people's, and especially the youth, plight to express themselves. So then government realized that, oh, okay, we can't play with the young people anymore. They tried this and that, but things could not work. The young people continued with that vigor. And I will tell you one thing, that civil society, especially that civil society like the organization that I'm coming from, Operation Young Vote, we vehemently went to young people in the communities, even at the risk of being, beaten, at the risk of being macheted by the supporters of the ruling party then. We went out in the communities and spoke to the young people and told them, look, you have to just make a decision now, register as a voter, because that's the only way you are going to express yourself without anyone interfering on your expression. Because when you go to line up to vote, no one will push you to say don't vote. They would want to manipulate you, tell you this and that to vote for this and that one. But you will have made a resolve yourself and say, I will vote for a political party or a candidate of my choice, the one that is going to help in answering to my plight. And of course, with the support of the donor community, we were able to go across the country. We received support ourselves, particularly from the United Nations Development Program and also from the US Embassy in Zambia. We had seriously, couched messages that spoke to young people to say, look, your vote is your choice. Your vote counts. You must cast it. It is your obligation. It is your right, and no one can stop you. And from that premise, we were able to, bring about a very robust youth, mobilization strategy that mobilized young people from across the board, whether it's in institutions of learning, whether it's on the street, whether it's the street adults or street kids, those that were eligible to register to vote and cast their vote. And just across communities, we were able to, have the young people trust our messages, and we did what we did. So just quickly in closing, so that maybe we can move to the next part. The issue of education is very important. And when I talk about education, I mean, we have political parties that come to give messages, either in the opposition or in government. They come and sell their messages to say, this is what we are going to do, and they publicize their manifestos and so on and so forth. But what we did as an organization, together working with other organizations, was that we were able to get these manifestos by these political parties and, simplify them and take them to the people of Zambia and say, this is what these people are saying. They said this in this period, and it never came to fruition. These people said this. So it's up to you to be able to choose who you think is going to be able to answer to your plight. And the issue of education, because young people really want to get an education, whether formal or informal, but they want to get an education that will be able to help them as as citizens to effectively, or to live dignified lives at individual level, but community level and national level. They want to contribute to the well-being of their families, but and the nation as a whole. So education, the message on education played a very critical role. So on one hand, we are looking at messages from political parties and politicians on ensuring that they provide the education that young people want. But on the other hand, when we talk of education, we also look at it from the young people who are educated and the young people that are not educated, in terms of them offering themselves to go and register as voters and cast the vote. One thing that we did was that, look, we indoctrinated the young people with the message that they needed to participate. They needed to have their NRCs, national registration identities or cards. They also needed to register as voters, but also beyond just registering, they needed to cast their vote. Now, you realize that a good number of young people, those that are educated, would want to, because they have, some of them are settled, they have what they want. So it's not easy for them to go and line up, get these documents and cast their vote. But I think this time around, it was a different ballgame, because then the corruption that was going on that time, the infringement on people's rights that was nakedly being perpetrated by the party and the government that time was so, inimical to people's enjoyment of their freedoms and rights, but also of them building their livelihoods. So young people, educated and the uneducated, where now we went with civic and voter education, inculcated the aspects of them taking this as their right, as their duty and their obligation, and that no one else would do it for them. It was them and it was their time. We saw that young people really were mobilized and did what they did in 2021. The issue of also trusting the players in the process, we saw that, of course, the trust for those in government had diminished because of what was happening. People went to the extent of just giving, political party cadres or supporters, if you like, who had not been to school, who would not do any business, but they were given huge sums of monies to go and display even on tarmacs, on roads, on streets, and just mock the Zambians. And Zambians felt that mockery was beyond limits and would not be accepted. So the ability also for leaders to listen to young people is one of the factors that could and should be taken seriously. Leaders, unfortunately, they tend to listen to people when they are not in government, but when they get in government, they change. The young people decided, okay, I think we have had enough. We need to do, what these people do not expect, and that was done. Maybe lastly, the issue of voter registration. Our EMB, our Electoral Commission of Zambia, did conduct voter registration in communities, in the very polling stations where people vote from. So it was a mobile voter registration conducted in the polling stations. They were now turned into registration centers, and one would register from their nearest point. But also that our registration was such that one would register from anywhere, but just indicate where they would vote from. For example, if I'm going to talk about, let me give an example of countries. If we say, okay, in Africa, we are going to vote, and Africa is a country, and Zambia is just a polling station, if you like, or a constituency, and I know that I'm going to vote from Zimbabwe or I'm going to vote from South Africa, but in the current registration or during the registration, that process finds me in Zambia. I will be able to register from Zambia, but just indicate that I will not vote from Zambia. I will vote from Cameroon, or I will vote from Zimbabwe or Kenya, or wherever I would vote from. Excuse me. So that also made it very easy for a lot of young people to register as voters, and I think we had those great numbers. Unfortunately, like I said, if you look at the young people that are today in Parliament, those that are below 35 years of age, we only have about 6%, a very minimal number, unfortunately. But if we, talk about the numbers that are, we include those that are above 35 but below 40, the number increases to about 14%, which is still so little and worrying. And there is need for us to even do more so that young people can do, can engage, as it were. Issues to do with the social media, internet, and this was very helpful. If you remember, in Zambia, there was actually a partial shutdown of the internet. I mean, social media was blacked out partially because then the regime that time felt that young people should not be able to communicate and
Guess, are you still on? We seem to have lost you there. Okay, I think we have lost Guess, but he was just about to wrap up, and I think very insightful lessons coming from Zambia in terms of the participation of young people and
results
also
and so on and so forth.
Sorry about that. So just insightful lessons coming from Zambia, as well as the conversation that seems to be going on about the role of political parties, the role of the shrinking of the civic space, which is something that is not uncommon to Zambia. I mean, we've seen it in Kenya, we've seen it here in South Africa and many other regions on the continent in terms of affecting the participation of young people, as well as young people actually taking matters into their own hands, which understandably is possible in a specific type of civic space, but as well as the creative methods in which young people had to organize themselves, which is something else that we see recurring. And as Spamanda rightly said, and as we would all agree, we cannot say young people are apathetic, disillusioned, yes, but definitely not apathetic as we see these methods of engagement and methods for young people to be heard. So I think we will take a question. We've got 2 questions from the chat box. So they are open to all the panels before we go back to our questions. The question reads, I think the panelists have seen it, so I open the question up to all of the panelists. Anyone can feel free to come in there, specifically relating to the youth leagues within political parties. The question says most, if not all, youth leagues within political parties are not actually preparing young people to lead in high structures of the political party while still in their youth cohort, but rather are used as weapons to fight factional battles in the party. I feel we need to rethink the organizing and mobilizing of youth political participation outside political parties. What is your take on that? And the question comes from Njabulo Tohane. I'll open this question up to the panelists.
Sorry, moderator, can you come again with the question?
So it is in the question and answer box. Let me just read it again, and then Sylvia can answer, and then we can go around the panel. It reads, most, if not all, of youth leagues within political parties are not actually preparing young people to lead in high structures of the political party while still in their youth cohort, but rather young people are used as weapons to fight factional battles in the party. I feel we need to rethink organizing and mobilizing of youth political participation outside political parties. What is your take on that? Sylvia, you can give us your take, and then the rest of the panelists can feel free to come in on that one.
Okay, so I think that's actually true. I think that assertion is actually quite true, because especially in Kenya, we've seen that youth leagues are just, first of all, they're not very well known. And even those who are known, or perhaps those who are in leadership, do not receive the adequate support that they require in the youth leagues. And then more specifically, an issue that I think that has come up from all the speakers is on the demographic of the youth. And so you find that especially young women, they are tussled between the youth leagues and the women leagues, because they go to the youth leagues and they're told you have the women's league, and the women league say, when they go to the women league, they say you should be in the youth league, and you see that so they're at a loss. There's I feel like they're at a more specific loss than perhaps youth in general. And so that's something for us to think about and try to look at just in trying to ensure that the participation of all the structures, or I would say the layers in the youth demographic. But moving on, I think one way we would be able to even strengthen these youth leagues is specifically focusing on students, especially those who are in tertiary institutions, universities and colleges. And I think Spamandla spoke a little bit about that. In Kenya, we had the Universities Amendment Act of 2016, which has limited participation of students even within their own institutions. So what has happened is, before they were able to use the universal suffrage sort of method to vote in their student leaders, but now they have to have the electoral college, which now eventually elects the leaders of the institution. And so this has really disenfranchised them, and they're not really able to participate in the process at the school level. And so I argue that if they're already disenfranchised at that particular level where they're gaining education, why then would we expect them to have interest in national politics or even at the local level, you know? So I think it would first begin by strengthening student unions, student leadership, trying to ensure that students already participate where they are in their educational institutions. And so we're trying to push for amendments towards this particular act to ensure that students are able to participate. But more importantly, it goes again back to support to the youth leagues. It goes back to ensuring that those who are in the leadership of the youth leagues have the capacity and are able to guide the youth league. And it's not just a league that now that we finished elections, it goes dormant and then revives again in 2027 just before the elections, but it's a sustained engagement with youth leagues. And further, also ensuring that caucuses. So we have caucuses, especially for in parliament, and we have the Kenya Young Parliamentarians Association, which I think could also be a good entry point to ensure that learning with young people who are in the youth leagues or young people at the community level, so that they're able to see that those who are already in parliament representing youth interests, or those who are already in parliament as youth have done this. These are the challenges they're experiencing. And even as I prepare myself to vie next election cycle, or even as I go vote next time, I know I would want a leader that represents my interests or is within my demographic group. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. I think you raised important points that speak almost to continuous civic engagement and education. So starting right from the grassroots, as well as meaningfully capacitating the youth league. So outside of the youth league, you know, university politics can play a part, but within the youth league to make their participation more meaningful. Thank you for that. I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to weigh in on that question.
Yes, moderator, may I come in? Go
ahead, please.
Thank you so much. I cannot agree more with what Sylvia has, brought to the table, except maybe just to add that it would be quite imperative to as much as possible, also concentrate on young people in the communities, those that are not in school, especially using the vehicle of civil society organizations or NGOs. This for me is really what is workable, especially where you find that in many instances, like what is obtaining now, there's that restriction with regards to young people in institutions of learning, in colleges and in universities. And in most cases, we see that politicians, especially those that have, you know, the financial muscle, whether it's those in the opposition or those in the ruling party, they tend to use and abuse the student movement, especially the leadership, the unions. And this we have seen over the years in Zambia. The independence of the students, populace, especially the leadership in the unions, is quite compromised to the point that they tend to, you know, toe the line of the funder. Okay, like the saying goes, he who pays the piper, I mean, detects the tune. So we see that this abuse is more prone in young people in universities and colleges, institutions of learning, as it were. But I also want to weigh in and agree with Sylvia where she spoke about the parliamentary caucuses. Yeah, we have one in Zambia, and led by the very youngest member of parliament, a lady in our country. She's the chairperson of that, and a number of those young people that are in parliament, all of them are. So if that vehicle is used to, or is structured in such a way that you know, it brings on board young people from all walks of life, regardless of their political orientation, they must be on board and, you know, champion the agenda of the young people. That for me would really work. The challenge that I see, which of course we need also to work on, I see that it's a tall order with regards to the young people in the youth leagues or wings of political parties. Why it is so? Because I think their independence is, or their robustness, their engagement in doing, you know, their work is mainly dependent on the main body or the senior members of the political party. It's quite different. Probably I saw this in the NCC previously, where we saw that there was that level of independence. But in many cases, because these are the young people that are vulnerable, these are the young people that have no jobs, these are the young people, and they tend to, like, you know, believe and go with those that dangle the carrots. And these politicians are so clever. They would want to ensure that they keep you dependent on them. And this is what we have seen in the youth leagues in most cases. However, it's possible that they can be changed, and especially when and where you have young people that have independent minds, whether they are coming from a poor background, as long as they understand and know that what they need to do is to be able to deal with their plight as young people. They must weigh in to be able to go to all these fora as equals. But where they go as being sponsored by the main body, then it becomes a bit problematic for these youth wings to be equal to the task with regards to ensuring that young people are on board in all endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you, Kes. Thank you very much. I think that's an important reflection on capacitating young people from all walks of life. We do have another question. I just want to know if any of the other panelists, Spamandla, Vuyokazi, would like to weigh in on this particular question.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think both of the previous panelists make quite important points around capacity building, specifically for youth leagues in particular. I think guests made an important point as well around the difficulty that is there for those who are prominent in youth leagues to actually start to speak out. There are this is by the way sort of situation where if as soon as you're spotted by a political senior in a political party to have your own constituency as a young person, in some instances, your voice is quite quickly limited in terms of the ways in which they create spaces for patronage. So you have either the offer, the dangling of a carrot saying, we'll give you this and that, but you need to be able to just keep quiet about certain things. We saw, for instance, how a nice gesture where post the 2016 fees must fall, 2015-2016 moment of fees must fall, young people were co-opted into the different leadership structures of both, I think it was provincial parliaments as well as National Assembly. But you would think those young people who are leading Fees Must Fall aren't as vocal as they were outside of those structures. And what is it innately about being put in those spaces that their voices and it has to be tempered to the extent that they don't feel the ability to speak out or speak from a more stronger position. And so that becomes quite a difficult one. I think what's important about capacity building across the board, especially when you talk about sustained civic education, is I think we need to start answering the right questions when it comes to civic education. I think we need to do more to answer the question of what's the point, why, what value accompanies my vote. And I think part of the work that Guest did along with these organizations and other collaborators in Zambia around saying, this is what your vote means. And then beyond that, I think part of what Njabulo was also asking is how do we sustain this beyond an election period, is saying, how do you maintain that momentum? Because it's important that when young people do show up and vote, hopefully 2024, but potentially even beyond that, when young people do come up and vote en masse, that we are able to sustain that level of participation beyond the election day itself, and say part of the work that needs to be undertaken is the vigilance of being part of a system of governance such as the one enabled by democracy, where your public participation in engaging with electoral amendment bill, for instance, or engaging with legislation, engaging with reports from the executive, that we mustn't just allow Parliament to be the ones who we've delegated our power to. And perhaps this is where the discussion around electoral reform starts to make more sense, whether we feel that Parliament is best placed to enact the level of accountability that we actually want as citizens. When the Concord went as far as to say, in the instance of the pay back the money, the work undertaken under the former President Zuma, saying that Parliament wasn't actually exercising its role in oversight, had failed its constitutional obligations. Why wasn't there more? Why weren't we louder against that system? And so I think that's essentially the sort of civic education sustained, but in terms of our messaging, we need to be slightly different. It's not enough to say people must vote, but it's also important to say why people's vote matters, especially in the absence of accountability and transparency from our institutions. How does our vote enable that accountability? And beyond that, how do we ensure, especially because of the advent of now coalition governments, that we're not lost in the messaging, because people are less considerate of what the manifestos and the ideology and what they're meant to be implementing insofar as policy is concerned, and they are more about vying for positions and patronage.
Thank you for that insight, Supermandla. I see Vuyokazi, you've unmuted your mic. You can go ahead and weigh in.
Yeah, I think we say in Xhosa umbethe emlonyeni, which is difficult to explain in English, but basically I think a lot of what Supermandla has said really does echo some of my own thoughts and just some of the notes I've been making. I think particularly, so the one point I wanted to raise, which I think was covered by some of Supermandla's inputs, is I think there is a danger really in focusing on a subset of youth, such as the youth in youth leagues or youth in universities and student movements, because that kind of creates a situation where a lot of young people might be excluded who don't have access to those institutions, those movements, etc. Which is where I think the aspect of civic education, particularly the message of civic education, because as Pamanda mentioned, it's one thing to encourage young people to vote or to tell people that your vote is your right and you can vote. I don't think that people are unaware of that. But I think what really is lacking in the messaging around why people need to vote are really the consequences of either voting or not voting, and the implications of what placing a vote for a particular party means. And really, I think the messaging really should be centered around, that your vote is a performance evaluation mechanism. It's something that, once you vote or not vote, it's something that can be used as a measure to see that the people we've placed in power, have they or have they not delivered on their mandates? What does that mean for us as young people, as previously disadvantaged groups, as marginalized groups? And moving forward, what are some of the things we can come to expect from voting or not voting? So I think that's really what is lacking for a lot of young people, to encourage them to vote. Is not that they don't know that they've got a right to vote and that they can vote, but what are the implications of those votes? What are the consequences of those votes? And what does it mean when you place your vote, and what mandates and what weight does your vote carry? So I think if that kind of education is put out there in the broader civic education endeavors, I think that is something that's the kind of information that is really needed to encourage youth participation in democratic and electoral processes.
Thank you so much for your Kazi, and thank you to the panelists. I think you've all touched on something that's very important, and that was going to be the content of my final question and reflections to you on the role of civic education in securing meaningful participation of the youth. But I think another thing that's coming up very strongly here as well, and perhaps you could weigh in on this in your final remarks, just after we go through the second question from Jabulo, and I think I'll read Landilani's comment just now, but the need for greater collaboration, because I mean, Spamandla and guests touched on this, and I mean, our panel is mostly in the civil society sector, and the role of civil society and community-based organizations cannot be undermined in securing the participation of youth. And I think a key question is, how do we see ourselves redefining our role in terms of greater collaboration? Because, we've sort of canvassed that other formal political processes are leaving youth on the peripheries, but civil society organizations are sort of coming in and playing that role. So how do we centralize that role? I know Spamandla says his details are freely available, and governments should actually start paying civil society organizations to do this work, because we are managing to do it meaningfully. But beyond that, how do we collaborate with young people, with the governments? Because a conversation we once had, a speaker says, we should move the conversation from how do we mobilize young people towards how do we, listen to young people who are already mobilized and input what they're saying. And I think that's a lot of what has been coming up in our conversations. So just to have this in mind as a parting shot, Njabulo asks, and again, this is key to the whole discussion of meaningful participation and civic education. after participating in the voting process as young people, what are the processes that we can participate in during the 5 or so years before the next electoral cycle, as a means of consistency in active participation? And just a comment regarding the youth leagues is that from Landilani Banda is that part of the problem regarding the role of youths in political parties is historical. In our struggle for liberation, young people, youths, were in the infantry and on the battleground against our oppressors, while decisions were made by the elders at the top. Post-liberation, the position of youths did not change. The trend has continued, only that now young people in political parties are on the battleground against each other. And I could not agree more, that those power dynamics have continued, albeit the changed situation. So I think as we wrap up, I would just like to open up the floor to the panelists and again to those who are joining us for any questions and comments. But I think to our panelists, how do you see us participating in our respective countries? Because I think this is an important aspect that actually sometimes as young people, we don't know what else we can do to participate, or we don't see it as useful. So what are some of the useful ways that we can participate beyond elections, so that when elections come, we're not falling prey to the carrot and the stick situation from political parties, and we are well informed that the other processes we've been taking part in have culminated in this, such that our vote then has a meaning at the end of the day. So if the panelists could address that question and perhaps give us your closing remarks on, a strategy or thoughts on how we can continue to improve our participation across the board, and ways in which perhaps we could collaborate for, meaningful effects with our governments, with those in position of power, to sort of, because at the end of the day, as much as it comes from our grassroots level, if the doors are closed in our faces constantly, or if we're not at the tables, we are still going to have these conversations. So I open that up to the panel. We'll have our closing remarks and just some reflections on those questions. Thank you. Pamandla, I see you've turned on your video.
Yeah. Sure. Perhaps just to try and ruffle some feathers. I think the problem with, I think one of the sentiments you're asking is around collaboration, specifically in the work of trying to mobilize or engage with already mobilized young people. I think the biggest fallacy, unfortunately, in our space of civic engagement is a civil society that pretends to be apolitical. I think that a lot of organizations have it in their value system that they are apolitical, but they have a particular political position. And so insofar as collaboration, sometimes we limit ourselves on the side of civil society because we ourselves espouse specific political values. And so sometimes, even in looking across the board, across the room, in the different conferences and convenings where we're at, we think about whether we can genuinely meet and collaborate towards the same sort of goal. And so political parties know this, political parties use this, not only in trying to create havoc in the civil society space, but also in trying to create havoc even within the voting population. And so that's the space in which we're stuck as a country generally in South Africa, is because of the diverging political ideology, but also just generally the ways in which we feel like processes ought to shift in order to handle the political environment. We don't agree on those things, but also we're not honest enough to say that we don't agree. And so that's essentially where the difficult part is. And then, of course, one thing that's behind that factor is our source of funding is so divergent and comes from different countries. And perhaps something that is not the view of my organization, but something that I try and speak to, is to the extent that donor communities should stop thinking that they have the ability to dictate the ways in which we work with one another as civil society organizations. In as much as we appreciate the funding, there's also a sense that, hey, listen, perhaps some of this is actually reparations, give us our money. And so as the disclaimer was there, that's not necessarily the view of my organization. And then, of course, in closing, in terms of what are the spaces that young people can participate in, I think it's important that we highlight that participation beyond elections, for instance, for young people is available in different spaces. There are different gatekeepers at those different spaces, and unfortunately, you will encounter them. But it's important that if you have a vested interest in the future of our country, that you start to get involved. At community level, we have ward committees, we have war rooms, specifically in KwaZulu-Natal, where there's a process of Operation Sukumasake, where communities in their different aggregation, women, children, people living with disabilities have the ability to engage with different departments that are provincially based, insofar as engaging with the governance structures. You have clinic committees, you have community policing forums. Those are ways of civic participation. It's not, so civic participation is not limited to either belonging to a political party or being engaged in a different way politically in that sense. Going to a municipal council meeting is open to the public. You have the ability to go and sit and see how your ward councillor is able to function or is doing the work. And if they're not doing the work, you have the ability to then say to the speaker's office, listen, so-and-so has not attended a meeting for 3 consecutive meetings. When is he either being rebuked? When is there a disciplinary process? What's the work? If you don't have joy, you also then go directly to their political party and you try and find ways of advocating in that regard. So there are multiple ways to engage, specifically at local level, but it can go as far as your provincial and national parliaments in that respect. So I think it's just, we just need to start thinking more creatively about how to collaborate, especially if we have an agreement about what are the core national interest issues that we're able to then work towards. The idea of electoral reform is something that I think it has the ability to mobilize quite a lot of people, especially if the electoral system that we end up with at the end is one that ensures accountability. Of course, what someone can say, you can change the system as much as you want. If the actors or the people involved in that system themselves aren't willing to play their part, they'll find loopholes. And so it's not enough for us to just rest with that fact, but it's about saying, how do we also, once we've changed the system, or if we're thinking about changing the system, how do we also change the actors to be more representative of what our needs are as citizens, specifically as young people? But also, I'm 30 years old, so I feel like I don't necessarily represent youth as much as I did back when I was 20, 22, whatever. When your time comes, as someone who is advocating for the youth voice, also give way for other young people to come into the space. Don't be territorial about leadership. Don't be territorial about access to certain spaces. And so otherwise you risk becoming exactly like the previous generation, our current leaders. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope these conversations can continue onwards and upwards.
Thank you so much for those insights, Pamandla. Before the next panelist comes, I'll just read a comment from Swali Mrehendi. They say that mine is not a question, but a comment on how young people can participate post-elections. Young people should show keen interest in current affairs so as to be able to hold the leadership accountable. Get well informed about the issues that are affecting your society and be able to point out the good and the bad about particular policies. If you're clueless about something, how will you be able to hold leaders accountable? Let's get interested in politics that affect us. And I think this speaks to the issue of continuous education and staying informed. I know we are a bit over time, so I'll just open up the concluding reflections for the rest of the panelists.
Okay, we'll go next.
Go ahead.
I think I'll first start with the question that was posed on how best we could be able to participate even after the voting process or outside the voting process. And first would be through public participation. I think the kind of legislation that Parliament churns out on a daily or annually is something that needs to be scrutinized, and especially by young people whose these legislative frameworks and policies would affect them directly. And so ensuring that you draft memoranda right to Parliament, both at the national level and at the county level, would be crucial in ensuring that you're holding the MPs and your representatives, if I may say, accountable. And so that would be one way. So continuous public participation, sustained engagement with members of Parliament would be a good way for you to be involved throughout the process. Also drafting of public petitions. If you see, just to build up on the last comment that Tariro has just read, just embracing current affairs and what's going on around your community. If you see something that's going wrong, you could draft a petition to your representative or to the Speaker of Parliament, and you'd be able to see some change or a report or something that has come out of that, and that would be one way. There's also the matter of just ensuring that, okay, now, but this now goes to government agencies, and I think this goes back to messaging. It's not just who and where and the what, it's even how. How do we share this message? And I think, and especially in Kenya, where internet penetration is very high and a very large number of young people have access to smartphones, leveraging on the internet to just share public participation calls and encourage public participation through internet. We don't need to be meeting physically. And I think COVID-19 showed us that there are more ways to be able to handle this governance matters as opposed to just always meeting physically. And so leveraging on the internet as a tool and civic tech tools that can be easily created and are available in the public domain to encourage public participation would be a good way. And for young people, it's even easier because they're always on their phones, we're always on our phones. And it would encourage participation in that regard. But more importantly, just still on that topic, and I think this would be perhaps one of my concluding remarks, would be the role of the internet in the entire electoral process and even in the political process. I think for us, one thing we've seen, especially in Kenya during the election period, was disinformation and misinformation. And what we saw was, while the internet was used for good, so there was sharing of information, you could see the electoral body was posting its press releases or any sort of information they wanted to share with the public via Twitter. And so it would be easy for people to share. Candidates were able to campaign online, and even citizens were able to hold some of the candidates accountable, because they would say, you would find they would meet online and a thread would begin, and people would say, you had stated that you would do this and this in 2017, and yet 5 years later, this has not happened. And that sort of conversation was happening in an online space, which I think was a good thing. But I think disinformation and misinformation plays a key role in undermining the political participation of young people. And even where accurate civic education messages have been shared, disinformation and misinformation have the capacity to just malign that and reduce its effectiveness. Good examples would be during the Kenyan election recently. We saw where, like on election day, there were reports that there were wild animals near some polling stations, or you'd even see that perhaps some candidates had already been declared as winners even before the electoral body had even come out with the official results, or even where there were allegations that the electoral body had mistakenly added votes to a particular presidential candidate. And you see, this has the capacity to affect the participation of young people rather, but even young women, I mean. But and so then there's a lot more that needs to be done, especially working with fact checkers. I think that's the way to go, especially for civil society organizations, ensuring that data journalism is accurate and can be verified. And so fact checkers come into play, and even working with these private companies, the social media companies, to ensure that the kind of content that is shared is moderated, and perhaps local civil society can be a great way to be able to ensure this. Just to be able to finalize, I also think it's important for us to think in terms of the political parties, which have been mentioned a lot, because, you know, there are key gateway, if I may say, towards the political process for young people. It's to ensure that we uphold transparency, especially during the nomination processes, supporting youth leagues, as has been earlier mentioned, and ensuring that even the nominations processes are transparent, are clear, and that they are institutionalized, as opposed to just having a political party revolving around a particular person, that it's open for all, and that youth leagues are a safe space for young people to be able to ideate, as has been said, and even to come up with new messaging and ways for the political party to be able to succeed. I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. Open up to the next panelist to just give brief concluding reflections.
Can I?
For your Kazi, you can go ahead.
Okay, cool. I'll be quick. Because I think a lot of what I would have said has been covered by the previous speakers. But I think really for me, closing remarks are that, the health of our democracy depends really on active civic and civil participation. And, voter apathy or low voter turnout or disillusionment in electoral processes is really an indication or a sobering reminder that our democracy is not a healthy one. And so I think, just to go back again, it really is important that voter education empowers people with, information about particularly what we just spoke about what happens after you vote. Because it's one thing to vote, but what happens after you vote, what kind of systems and processes are available for people to continue sustained engagement with democratic processes, with governance processes. So and in South Africa, we shouldn't ignore the fact that that is part of the IEC mandate, and really they should be held accountable to ensuring that they deliver part of their mandate, which is to continue providing voter education and providing accessible information on how people can continue to access participatory processes regarding to the governance and functioning of each of our countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Kazi. Guess you can weigh in on your final remarks.
Well, thank you very much. I'll be quick also, especially that a lot of things have been said by my colleagues. For me, I think we need more than anything else affirmative action from different players, especially from those in leadership in government. I think it's hypocritical to campaign on the road of wanting to change the plight of the youth, improve it. Then when you have an opportunity and the privilege to be in power to do that, then you want to completely ignore what you campaigned on. I think for me, there's need for that affirmative action from those in leadership with regards to the legislation, but also with regards to the policy framework. It's important. When it comes to collaboration, I think it's important that this is done, because as it were, none of us has answers to the problems that the young people are facing. None of us singularly has these answers. But when we get together, when we collaborate, when we do things, as one, even from the person that you think they may not add value, when you bring them on board, you realize that probably they are the ones that have a better, view of dealing with the challenges that you may be facing as a people. And with this, for me, when I talk about the framework, governments must look at issues to do with national youth development, generally, not from a political angle or from the political lenses. There must be a framework that capacitates the engagement of young people, just generally in development, in governance, and all endeavors as it were, in our jurisdictions. I know that Comrade Spamandla spoke about the issue of the young people engaging in municipal councils. I mean, these are free. You don't need to pay anything to go and listen to how your leaders articulate matters, how your leaders really speak to policy and the issues that affect you. So young people must be encouraged, by all means, to take this, because this is within their locality. They must also get to meet their leaders at different levels. Current affairs, you spoke about current affairs. It's important, for example, what happens in our jurisdiction, and I think maybe this is common in Africa and even beyond, that when you post, some nudie photo, everyone would want to have it. But when you post something that deals with, here is the youth policy and how can we improve it, believe me, very few, if any, of the young people will have interest and engage in that particular discourse and conversation. So it's important that we begin to have this paradigm shift in our the way we engage young people, so that they appreciate that it is more beneficial to engage in these issues that deal with our participation and our well-being, as opposed to this thing that just may stimulate our feelings here and there. In ending, I want to share a few things that my organization is doing post-election. Maybe colleagues can get one or two things. We are doing programs we are calling Democracy and Governance Focus Group Dialogues. So these meetings are being done by our young people across the country. And our organization is structured in such a way that we have chapters in all the constituencies. And some of the constituencies, Zambia has 156 constituencies. Some of them are too large, too big, too huge. And because of that, we have these constituencies, broken down into community, these chapters broken down into community chapters, okay? Now, these community chapters, the young people between a minimum of 10, a maximum of 25, they sit together and, bring an issue that affects them, whether it's locally or it is nationally. They deliberate upon that issue. And upon deliberating on that issue, then it feeds into a program that we are calling the Follow Your Vote campaign. A Follow Your Vote campaign is basically a social accountability program. It is framed in such a way that, civic leaders, traditional leaders, traditional authority, the young people themselves, and it is being championed by the young people themselves, and everyone sits together and begins to look at the issues that affect them as a community. And this is quite progressive for us, in the sense that it brings, it bridges that gap where when a leader is elected, they disappear, and the next moment they come is when they are campaigning again to be re-elected to office. So it bridges that gap, that a leader finds time to get to the people and engages, so that at the end of the day, they speak to the issues of development together. They move at the same pace. But also, it negates this issue of violence, because then young people from different quarters sit together and speak about the issues of violence. And even when one person would want to come in and disturb them or sponsor them to fight each other, but because they have that rapport that they've created between and amongst themselves, they want to continue on that brotherly and sisterly engagement. So this Follow Your Vote campaign for us is a program that is running between the elections. Zambia had elections last year. The next election is in 2026. And for us, we want this campaign to run so that those that pledged, whether it's in the opposition, as long as they are in leadership, they should be able to answer to some of the issues that they did pledge, but also some of the issues that they are responsible to be able to give, not only what they pledged, but what they are duty bound to give. So this, maybe it may help colleagues to get one or two things from, we do it through radio programs, TV programs, and just physically meeting the people on the ground and meeting with the leaders themselves so that they are able to give their, whether it's reasons why they are not giving what they promised, or whether they have given and probably one or two things is missing. So it's, for us, it's quite progressive and quite beneficial. I thank you.
Thank you, Ges, and thank you for the insights of all the panelists. I think the key message that's coming out is continuous engagement, but also meaningful engagement. I would like to apologize. We have gone slightly over time, but I think you agree that the inputs that we have received and the discussion we've had this afternoon has been very insightful and valuable. We have come to the end of our discussion this afternoon, and I would like to thank our panelists for making time and making your useful contributions to participate on our webinar this afternoon. I'd also like to thank those who have attended and those who have engaged with us in the question and answer box. It is important, as all of the colleagues have said, and as we continue to allude to, that we should have these conversations as ongoing conversations, not simply, before or after elections. And from the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit, we will continue to have these conversations, and beyond having conversations, we will let these conversations culminate into tangible policy papers, tangible programs, and solutions that will actually, lead to the changes that we would like to see. Again, I extend a warm thank you very much to our panelists, Ms. Vuyokazi Fuchane, Ms. Sylvia Katua, Mr. Spamandla Mtlongo, and Mr. Ges Nyirenda. I'd also like to thank the communications team behind the scenes for assisting us with the webinar, and everyone who has joined us this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us, and I wish you a good afternoon further.
Thank you, moderator. Have a blessed day.
Thank you, Tariro.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Tariro. Thank you, everyone.